Carolivia Herron wrote this children's book, Nappy Hair, about an African-American girl and how her long, kinky hair becomes a symbol of pride in her heritage. It was in the news recently when some New York City parents protested its use in class. They claimed the use of the book was racially insensitive. The first-grade teacher, the woman you see pictured here, Ruth Sherman, transferred to a different school. She has since met the author, and the two are considering writing a teaching guide for the book. Now Carolivia Herron reads from and discusses Nappy Hair.
And why I chose it as evidence of African-American oral tradition. One of the things that happens when a poet has to tell us a poem orally is that he's got to think of something to say to the audience while he's figuring out what to say next. He doesn't have everything in his mind. He's got to make it up as he goes along. And one of the ways a poet will do this is to use some form of poetry or art or literature that's already made up somewhere outside of the story and bring it in to keep the audience occupied while he goes on with thinking up, now what's going to happen next, what's going to happen next. And in this case, one of the things my Uncle Richard used to keep the story going while he figured out what to say next is the blues. I don't know if any of you noticed the blues phrases that were in here, but I will, with my inadequate voice, but I'll try to sing them for you. Anyway, this is the story about, this is about the slavery section, which is one of the sections that caused so much trouble when it was taught in Brooklyn. Sold your mama for a nickel and your daddy for a dime. You see, that's the standard blues song. I say they sold your mama for a buffalo, and your daddy, they sold him for 1 thin dime. So he's using, my uncle is using this blues form because this is all memorized. He doesn't have to think about this part while he figures out where to take the story next. And this is the same kind of technique that's used in the great European classical poems, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and all the great classical poems that are usually taught as a part of Western tradition. And one of the things I was trying to show is that African tradition has many of the same techniques that the great poems of Europe have. And my field as a scholar is epic. And that's what that's why you can tell that when I talk a lot about it. Another thing that this poem is doing, I consider this a poem, even though it's written as a children's story, is it's a praise song in the tradition of West Africa. The person who is honored by a particular culture, in this case it's my family in Washington, D.C., at the time I recorded my uncle giving this story, I was teaching as a professor at Harvard University. In the section where he says, them old hard-headed think they can talk English, he's talking about my professors, my co-professors at Harvard. He had just seen me on television, and where them old hard-heads think they can talk English, well, this child talks the King's English. What is he? He's saying someone has left the African-American community of Washington, D.C., gone to this place of high repute, and can speak as well as they speak. And for those of you who have some trouble using this book, saying, well, gee, it's teaching bad English, ain't this and ain't that, and all these things that are not good English, although it's using African-American dialect, it's a praise song for someone who can do both and who can talk the King's English and the Queen's English. And in the classroom, I'm suggesting that people use that page when they come to the question of how do you teach this book without teaching non-standard English. And in defense of the use of dialect, or African-American dialect, it reminds all the readers that most of the great languages that we know of, or probably all, but I don't know all of them, but certainly English is a dialect of German. All the Romance languages were dialects of Latin. That's why it's Latin America, Spanish. And what made those languages change from dialects into languages? Some great poet came along and wrote a great poem in those languages, and then they became languages. We had Chaucer do that for English. We had Dante do that for Italian, and so forth. Anyway, that's just to say that there's no reason to say that is African-American dialect the only dialect in the world that has no great poetry in it? And, of course, my answer to that is no.